breathing, pressure would go up inside your stomach, and then as soon as you would burp, you're going to have like a Linda Blair out of the Exodus kind of event where everything's going to come spurting out. We hate when that happens. That receptor relaxation allows you to consume probably more food than you really should. Okay. Function of the stomach. We're just mostly storing this undigested food. Right? There's a mechanical breakdown. We're churning food inside of here. There's an additional layer of smooth muscle that's going to allow your stomach to kind of wring it down towards the pylorus here. All right. All the other layers we mentioned of your digestive tract have the 2 layers of smooth muscle, right? There's a circular layer surrounded by a longitudinal layer to allow for that peristalsis, right? Stomach has a 3rd layer, an oblique layer that goes in an angle around it here that allows it to churn a little bit better. What else is going on in the stomach? Well, there's some disruption of chemical bonds, the acids and the enzymes we'll speak of. But this one here we've spoken of before, the production of intrinsic factor. Because intrinsic factor is required for the absorption of vitamin B12. Without vitamin B12, you develop pernicious anemia. And chyme, we've talked about this term before, right? Have we? When you're swallowing food, what do we call that thing that you're swallowing? A bolus. It's a bolus when it's through your esophagus and your stomach. Now this semi-solid kind of sluice we refer to as chyme. It'll stay this way until it gets into the large intestine, and then what's ever left over is going to become fecal matter. See, here's that picture of the stomach. They're showing this additional oblique layer that you don't find in the other ones here. You've got the circular, the longitudinal, this other additional oblique layer here. This is showing the end of the stomach, the pylorus that has that sphincter in it that's going to be regulating gastric emptying. Because once you're on the other side of that pyloric sphincter, now you're into the proximal section of the small intestine, which is the what? Just showing a picture. That's nice. Okay, moving on. Microscopic anatomy here. Probably the most important thing to know about the anatomy of the stomach is just what the different sort of cells are producing here. And here's where we're going to get to some testable material here. All these juices that are produced by the stomach are produced in these little pits. They call these little pits gastric pits. Good name for these gastric pits. There's a lot of them up in the fundus, that little gas collecting area at the top, a lot near the top in the fundus, even near the cardiac region. The body has a lot of these things. And we have several different types of cells that you're going to be testing. This is really where test material starts in here. I'm not going to test you on mucous neck cells because if you couldn't figure out that mucous neck cells produce mucus, well, it's just time. It's time to turn in your keys, say goodnight. But the other ones are important. Now, the mucus, obviously, you should realize is, I might ask you what's the function of the mucus, and you should be able to tell me that the function of the mucus is to protect the stomach from what? The acid. It needs, it produces very alkaline mucus, all right, with bicarbonate in it, very alkaline, to protect the stomach from the acid that's being produced. It's one of the protective mechanisms. The other protective mechanism I mentioned before is just an amazingly rapid turnover of the cells of the stomach. Every 3 days. Did I mention that number before? I will mention that now if you didn't get it before. Every 3 days, you basically have an entire new stomach lining. That's how rapidly these cells are being produced. They start producing them. The new cells are divided by mitosis, generally down towards the bottom of it here, more down. They get pushed their way out until they make up the lining of the stomach. Very rapid turnover. The other type of cells here, parietal cells. Parietal cells produce 2 things. First, they produce hydrochloric acid, HCl, hydrochloric acid, and they also produce intrinsic factor. The parietal cells secrete what 2 things? Hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. What's the intrinsic factor needed for?
B12.
Oh, I forgot, yeah, the absorption of what?
Vitamin B12.
Vitamin B12. What do you need that for?
So you don't get pernicious anemia.
Oh, so you don't get pernicious anemia, right, okay, because I forgot that. Okay, thank you for reminding me of that. All right. The hydrochloric acid is going to make the gastric juice highly acidic, anywhere from like 1 to 3. It has, your stomach, we're going to see, kind of has a set point of 2. When there's food in the stomach, there's kind of a set point. It's going to try to keep it 2. If the stomach acid levels start to rise and the pH drops too much, like down to closer to 1, then that's going to kind of shut off the acid production. Now, proteins are natural buffers. I think we've sort of talked about this a little bit already, like that for example, hemoglobin inside of red blood cells is also an important buffer. So why am I mentioning this? Well, when you start to consume a diet that's got some protein in it, the proteins that you consume are going to start to do what to the stomach acid? Neutralize it, buffer the stomach acid. And that means when you start to eat proteins that the pH is going to start to do what? Go up, all right, become less acidic, all right? And that's going to trigger the stomach to produce more acid to try to drop the pH back to about 2. So 2 is kind of a normal kind of set point. And there's a couple of different types of hormones and neural responses that tend to trigger this production. Let's get to this in a second. So we've done the parietal cells here. The hydrochloric acid we also mentioned is required for the activation of pepsinogen into pepsin. Now the pepsinogen is going to be made by a different sort of group of cells here. Now of course the other big thing about the hydrochloric acid, it's denaturing proteins, especially the proteins of the microorganisms that might be in your food. It's a holding tank, if you will, made to primarily kill microorganisms to make it safe a little further down the digestive tract. We will come back to this in a second to talk about the things that trigger the production of hydrochloric acid. But I want to mention the other type of cell that are called chief cells. The type of cells that are called chief cells that are being shown kind of in a purplish color for no apparent reason, but they just are. It's these chief cells that secrete pepsinogen. Pepsinogen, of course, is the inactive form of pepsin. Every place that you secrete protein enzymes, in the stomach and from the pancreas, they're all created, I should say, as proenzymes in their inactive form. Because if all these cells that were creating enzymes that digest proteins, it would kill the cell that's making them if they were in their active form. So all protein digesting enzymes, starting in the stomach, have to be secreted in as proenzymes, these inactive forms. And the one in the stomach, pepsinogen, gets converted into pepsin by the acid. Now, there are other cells in here. I'm not going to ask about the name of this diffuse neuroendocrine system cells. It's a horrible name. But I am going to ask you about the G cells in the stomach that secrete gastrin. First of all, it makes more sense. It's a lot shorter. It's a lot easier to write than to try to write diffuse neuroendocrine system cells. I hate that. But G cells produce gastrin, and this should be something that should be a little bit easier to know because that term from gastrin tells you we're dealing with what part of the body? The stomach. So gastrin is a hormone, a local acting hormone, that is one of the 3 that trigger acid production. Its main job is to trigger what?
Acid production.
Acid production. It's a big one. Somatostatin, not even going to ask about here since we're low on time. It doesn't seem to have a whole lot of clinical relevance as far as I've been able to sort of determine here. But G cells produce what? Gastrin. And we'll see in a minute in the next slide what triggers it to produce gastrin. It shouldn't come as a big surprise because gastrin is going to make you secrete more acid. That's going to help to digest food and activate protein digestion. That one of the major things that's going to trigger you to secrete more gastrin are proteins in your diet, especially when they start to get digested in the stomach. So gastric mucosal, not going to go into this in any more detail, but we've already mentioned that the mucus that's in the stomach is rich in bicarbonate ion to do what? Why have that bicarbonate ion in the mucus?
To protect the lining of the stomach.
Protect the lining from
Acid.
the acid. It's going to help to neutralize the acid here. We mentioned that the entire mucosal is every 3 to 6 days. 3 days in the stomach, 6 days closer into the intestines. Even the intestines have a rapid turnover, not as rapid as the stomach. Okay. A little bit tricky, but I want to show you the things that trigger stomach acid production. 3 things that get tied in with the nervous system. First of all, is it going to come as a shock that vagal stimulation should increase stomach acid production? Should that come as a shock to anybody? I'm hoping at this point it shouldn't come as a shock, because you should be familiar with the fact that the vagus nerve is the major nerve of your parasympathetic nervous system, and that your parasympathetic nervous system specializes in really micromanagement of digestion. It's really where it shines, in digesting. So that vagal stimulation of the stomach is going to increase the production of acid. And because it's part of the parasympathetic nervous system, it's going to secrete the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Where's ACH? Here's ACH, acetylcholine. Does the parasympathetic nervous system use any other neurotransmitter aside from acetylcholine? The answer is no. Acetylcholine is the only neurotransmitter used by the parasympathetic nervous system. What was the primary neurotransmitter used by the sympathetic nervous system? Norepinephrine. There was a tiny number of sympathetic effects that were done by acetylcholine, effect on blood vessels, for example. But when you think ACH, acetylcholine, in the periphery, you should think parasympathetic nervous system. So the vagus nerve will secrete that. And that triggers, between acetylcholine and gastrin, all right, triggers the production of acid. And one other thing that's triggered by acetylcholine by these cells is histamine. Now, histamine, we've already talked about in conjunction with we've talked about that in conjunction with what? Inflammation, right? Because histamine is one of the final mediators of inflammation. We talked about how inflammation has like top level mediators, like TNF, tumor necrosis factor, and then final mediators like histamine. And it came as a shock when they found out that histamine is not only just used for that, but also very important for triggering stomach acid production. And they found this out really by mistake, because they found out that people who were taking antihistamines for like nasal congestion or other things like this often had decreased symptoms of acid reflux or other kind of gastric conditions. They thought, oh, maybe there's a link between them, and sure enough, they discovered that taking antihistamines, certain antihistamines, not only block their inflammatory response, but also block their ability to trigger stomach acid production. And so you can come across a lot of antacids, if you will, for treatments that block the action of histamine here. They're called H2 receptor antagonists, like Tagamet. There's a really common one that you see here. Cimetidine is like the active ingredient in it. So for huge acid production, you need gastrin and histamine and the acetylcholine that's triggering it. Those three things for full acid production. What are the full three? Gastrin, histamine, and acetylcholine. Because the acetylcholine is also going to be activating parietal cells and chief cells to produce their compounds directly themselves. All three of those things required for full acid production. So people that have acid reflux can treat it in several different ways here. Now, I mentioned that the stomach has like a set point of around 2, all right? But for people that are feeling like a lot of gas and having stomach upset like this, they'll often take something like a Tums, chewable Tums here, those kind of antacids. What those antacids contain are just acid neutralizing compounds, like bicarbonate, basically like calcium bicarbonate, magnesium bicarbonate. There's always bicarbonate in those Tum-like sort of things there. Will they neutralize the stomach acid? Everybody should say yes. The only issue is once they neutralize the stomach acid, your stomach doesn't know any better. Think, oh my gosh, there's no acid here. What should I do? Let's produce more. So that when you're taking Tums for having like that kind of acid stomach, the effect tends to be kind of transient. After a while, after an hour, your stomach is going to start to build up more because it doesn't know any better. Which is why a lot of those people, have those kind of acid kind of issues, just keep popping those Tums like sort of nonstop all day. But if you take things that block the action of histamine, all right, you can't take the histamine blockers when your stomach is already upset because it takes a while. It has to get in your bloodstream 20 minutes later or something like this. So you take things like Tagamet or other H2 blockers before you eat a meal. There are other things that can block acid directly that are called proton pump inhibitors. You see like Pepsid that do that. So there's a lot of different ways that you can combat having too much stomach acid. But again, the big three things, gastrin, histamine, and acetylcholine. So if I didn't mention that before, I think it's worth noting now that the parietal cells secretion of hydrochloric acid is affected by 3 chemicals.
Yeah.
It's called reading. 3 chemicals, ACH, gastrin, and histamine. So maximal secretion requires the presence of all 3. Phase of gastric activity. Cephalic, gastric, and then intestinal. So cephalic is almost always, all right, let me back up. All of these different sort of phases, cephalic, gastric, intestinal, have some elements that can be excitatory, other elements that could be, if some elements might be excitatory, others might be inhibitory. See how that game works, people? Excitatory, inhibitory. It's been a long weekend, people. Been a long weekend? I'm guessing that. Okay, long weekend here. Okay. Waiting for the warm weather, are we? Is that what we are here? Brain freeze right now with that cold weather? Okay. So all of them have basically potential for positive and negative digestive effects. However, the cephalic phase is normally very excitatory. Anything that's going to trigger you to produce saliva, just the thought of food in your mouth, anything that's going to make you start producing saliva will also trigger more gastric secretions. So it tends to be excitatory. The gastric phase is triggered by the actual physical presence of food in your stomach, the distension, the chemicals in here, and this is almost always very strongly excitatory. Excitatory. Big excitatory, big couple of plus signs next to it. It's excitatory. Intestinal, negative. The intestinal phase is mostly inhibitory. The idea being is that when food comes down to the intestines want to say, oh, hold on a minute. Give me a chance. Give me time to digest this food here, all right? We don't want it coming down too quickly in the intestines, so give us time to process it. So the more food comes down in the intestine, it's going to send signals back up to the stomach to slow things down. Excitatory. Excitatory, mostly inhibitory. So let's take a look how that would sort of work here. Cephalic, as I've already mentioned, anything that would trigger the production of saliva that we've already talked about. The thought of food, especially if you're hungry. The sight of your favorite foods. The smell. The taste of, oh my goodness. Oh. My stomach is producing acid right now, just thinking about all that. Now, I'm not going to ask you about the cranial nerves that do that, like the facial nerve that are going to make you start to secrete more of that saliva here. Cranial nerve number 9s that do that. Again, anything that's going to make you secrete more saliva is going to make your stomach start to grumble. Mm-hmm. And you probably experienced this in your life, haven't you? Mm-hmm. All right, because you all have lived a life. Right. The stomach phase. Gastric phase here. Gastric phase initiated by the presence of food in the stomach, both neural and hormonal players in this game here. Neural, distension of food is going to cause short reflexes and then long reflexes via the vagal nerve, vagal reflexes here. They're going to try to increase mucus, acids, pepsinogens, everything, and increase the grinding motility. This is what will really make your stomach grind you. And hormonal, the G cells are stimulated by partially digesting proteins, caffeine, by the way. I want to ask about that, but caffeine is one of the very few things that are actually get absorbed in your stomach. Caffeine and alcohol. And NSAIDs, like aspirin, that can be absorbed in your stomach as well. It can actually trigger some bleeding issues here. That's a whole sort of separate issue with NSAIDs and their effect on the gastric mucosa. But these G cells are going to train by having partially digested proteins. They're going to cause you to release what hormone? Gastrin. Gastrin secreted from what cells? G cells. Isn't that a good name for the cells? G cells. Wouldn't it be horrible if some horrible professor in the back, let's call them 8 cells, just to piss off the students that have come after me here who've written horrible things about me on Rate My Professors. I'm going to make their life really miserable by naming things that they will never understand. Y'all don't know what I'm talking about here. So G cells produce what, everybody? Gastrin, right? And the distension of the stomach, the stretching of the stomach is going to trigger it to release what?
Histamine.
Hormone? Is histamine also going to be critical for acid production?
Yes.
Absolutely. So again, mostly excitatory. I'm not going to ask you about the inhibitory kind of responses, but I have mentioned that if your pH sort of drops below 2, that kind of, if it gets too acidic, it will automatically kind of shut off acid production to try to maintain that pH around 2. That's not really a great test question, but you should realize in your mind someplace that 2 is a good set point for your stomach. If you start to create too much acid, it's going to slow it down until the pH rises. All right. So now what's going on in the stomach here? The stomach has its own rate of churning, just like the stomach has, just like the heart has a pacemaker that sets the normal pace of your heartbeat. I wonder what that was in the heart. Was there a pacemaker in the heart? Some kind of node in the heart that was setting the pace for the heart. Oh, right, the SA node, thank you. Because I'd forgotten that shit, just like all of you apparently had forgotten that. Okay, here, here. Oh, you were saying that? I just wasn't listening. I'm old and deaf. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you there. Okay. My bad. But in this case here, the pacemaker cells, or the cells of Cajal, are the cells that are setting the pace for the stomach. About 3 waves of peristalsis per minute is the normal sort of rate of churning of your stomach. Now, these peristaltic waves die out if there's no food in the stomach. They'll start to be spread out from these cells of Cajal, and then they just die off, so you're not wasting a lot of energy. But when there's food in your stomach, those waves will persist and they're gonna wring your stomach like this, like wringing out a mop, and we're wringing it towards the pylorus. All the squeezing is done as we're trying to wring all this food down by that pylorus, that thick pyloric sphincter. Now, that sphincter is gonna stay closed most of the time, so as we wring that food down, if it's closed, most of it's gonna end up shooting back up the other direction. All right, we're trying to wring it down, it's gonna sort of shoot back up. But every type of ring of contraction, you're gonna squirt maybe about a teaspoon or so of chyme out of the pylorus into the small intestine. About a teaspoon to a tablespoon, not a whole lot, gets squeezed out every contraction so that we're gonna slowly empty the contents of the stomach. Does everybody understand? Everybody okay with the cells of Cajal? C-A-J-A-L? It's the Spanish pronunciation, the J. Do I have to go over this? No. So again, they are the natural pacemaker cells of the stomach. Now, the intestinal phase, we said, is normally inhibitory. The idea behind it is once we start to have chyme coming down to the small intestine, we need time for, first of all, we need time for the intestinal juices to neutralize the stomach acid, all right? But we also need time to digest the products. So we are going to create a reflex. And this is an important thing to look at here, is this reflex here, this enterogastric reflex. Now, first I need you to understand how you read the name of this reflex, because there are other reflexes that are going to be similar. The first part of that reflex, entero, or entero, is a prefix referring to intestines. So entero refers to what? Intestine. Gastric refers to stomach. So there are several types of reflexes that you're going to come across in the digestive tract that are going to have sort of similar names that might look similar. You might have like a gastroenteric reflex. How would a gastroenteric reflex differ from an enterogastric reflex? Here's how you read them. The first part tells you where the reflex is being initiated from. The last part of the term tells you its target. First part of the term, entero, tells you where it's being initiated from. The last part tells you its target. So where would the enterogastric or enterogastric reflex be initiated from? The intestines. And its target is going to be the stomach. So this reflex is primarily triggered by food coming down into the small intestine, especially acidic food, because we're going to need time to neutralize that acid. Especially fatty foods, because it's going to take a while for us to then emulsify it with bile salts, digest it with pancreatic lipase. Hypertonic means extremely like salty, very concentrated. And generally speaking, almost everything you consume in a meal is going to be hypertonic, unless you're drinking basically like pure water. Almost everything is going to be slightly hypertonic. And so this reflex here, this enterogastric reflex, all right, is going to inhibit all those gastric secretions, inhibit gastric motility, again, to give you, decrease the ability of the pyloric sphincter, keep the pyloric sphincter nice and tight. And again, this reflex is going to allow it to allow the intestines time to process this food here. There's also a family of hormones that go by a similar name that are called enterogastrones. And there are two that you will see multiple times on Thursday's test. That's this hormone cholecystokinin that you can just abbreviate as CCK. And the other hormone is secretin. S-E-C-R-E-T-I-N. GIP, not going to worry about, not going to test you on. Inhibitory peptide. But these two are biggies. Cholecystokinin and secretin. Or secretin. 6 of 1. So here's the overview of these two hormones. We'll see it in later pages, but let me give you the overview right now because it's been worth seeing again. CCK, cholecystokinin, is primarily released in response to the partially digested foods, especially partially digested lipids and proteins. CCK primarily released in response to what? Partially digested foods, fats especially. Where secretin, or secretin, is primarily released in response to acid. What triggers the release of cholecystokinin? Partially digested foods, especially fats, partially digested protein. What triggers the release of secretin?
Acid.
What glands are going to be dumping digestive fluids into the duodenum? What glands, organs, are going to be dumping digestive fluids into the duodenum? The pancreas? Does the pancreas just really secrete one kind of fluid? How many different kinds? 3. Only if you're missing a finger. You've been in a farm accident? Okay. Yeah. But for the rest of us, I'm going to jump into 2. One is a bicarbonate fluid, right? But it also secretes digestive enzymes.
B.
Bicarb. I could be writing out bicarbonate, but who has time? Bicarb. Because you're in the biz, you just bicarb. The other thing the pancreas secretes is going to be enzyme fluid. And enzyme rich. Will the enzymes the pancreas secretes, will at least one of them be able to digest starch? Yes. Amylase. Will they be able to, some of them be able to digest proteins? Yes, 4 different proteases. Will they be able to digest lipids? Lipase. Will they be able to digest nucleic acids? Yes. Yes. Pancreas secretes enzymes that will digest, hydrolyze, the magic term, every category of organic compounds, all 4 different categories of organic compounds. So that's our pancreas. What else gets dumped into the small intestine? I'm sorry? Bile from the liver gallbladder. I'll do liver/gallbladder. And of course, the bile salts are critical for doing what?
Emulsify?
Bile salts do what? What triggered the release of cholecystokinin? Partially digested foods, right? Here's a hint. These two hormones that we talk about not only have an impact here, but their major effect is on the release of juices into the small intestine. The major effect of cholecystokinin and secretin are going to be the trigger, the release of these different digestive juices. Now, you get to tell me what they do. Let's actually start with secretin. Let's do it easier here. Take it easy. What was secretin released in response to?
Acid.
Acid, right? What do you think that would trigger the release of? The bicarb fluid? Huh, why? Because the bicarb would do what? Would neutralize the acid. So in response to the release of secretin, that's going to trigger the release of the bicarbonate-rich fluid. What about CCK, cholecystokinin? It's released in response to what?
Partially digested.
Partially digested foods, especially fats. What do you think it will trigger?
Bile salt.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear which one?
Bile salts.
Bile salts. Anything else, you think? Thank you. Does that make sense? It's more important that it makes sense to you. Oh yeah, of course, CCK release in response to partially digested food would naturally trigger the release of compounds and digestive enzymes that would continue to break it down, right? And secretin, if it's released in response to what? Acid, would trigger the release of the pancreatic secretions of this bicarbonate fluid that would then neutralize all of that acid. Hope that makes a little bit of sense. Maybe?
A little bit.
It's Monday, okay, yeah.
It
Feels like Monday. I know it's Tuesday, but it feels like Monday. So all this is trying to show here is intestinal phase. Again, we said it was primarily negative, which means in response to these things that would tend to cause you to secrete more of the things in the intestine are going to slow down everything in the stomach. That's a good thing to sort of keep in mind. Anything that's going to speed up digestion in the intestines is going to tend to slow down things in the stomach, just to give your intestines time to do its work. So both of those things, like secretin and gastrin, for example, tend to slow down stomach things, Slow down stomach acid production, for example, especially the secretin. Secretin going up means you've got too much acid, right? A lot of acid. You're going to slow down the acid production. And here's these two in summary here. Cholecystokinin, CCK. Release in response, primarily in response to what? Partially digested proteins and lipids that are found in the duodenum. Stimulates the pancreas to secrete what?
Enzyme.
The enzyme rich. Did we already do that? Yeah, we did. It also triggers the gallbladder to contract and then relax the sphincter that allows it to go into the duodenum. The sphincter is just called the sphincter of Oddi. Keeps the pyloric sphincter constricted. Makes you feel full, apparently. But secretin is released in response to what? Right, acid. Decrease in pH means acid production is going up, right? So it's going to inhibit the stomach. Inhibit motility, increase bile output. The big thing again, it stimulates the release of what? The bicarbonate-rich pancreatic juice. GIP. Yeah, nothing going on. All right, so digestion, absorption in the stomach. Digestion we've already talked about. We begin protein digestion here. In the stomach again, the pepsin will start to digest it. There's limited carbohydrate digestion because salivary amylase can keep working for a little bit here. Nutrient absorption, again, for all intents and purposes, nothing, really. Alcohol, because alcohol is so lipid soluble, it can be absorbed. NSAIDs, a little bit of caffeine, but very, very little. NSAIDs can be absorbed here. Really just think about it as being a holding tank. It's just a PBJ. We can get rid of this one here. Small intestine. Small intestine, now this is the name of the game, people. Because this is where virtually all digestion is. First of all, it's going to be finished. 80% of your digestion is going to go on here. And with a few exceptions, virtually all absorption of nutrients in the foods you eat, that's going to all occur in the small intestine. Absorption of most water and electrolytes and vitamins, almost everything is going to be going on in where? The small intestine. It starts at the pyloric sphincter, goes to the ileocecal valve where it meets the cecum. You saw that in your fetal pigs here. And we have three different segments. Tell me what they are in order. Duodenum, jejunum, and then ileum. Remember I said that most of the regional changes can be found in the submucosa. We were talking about the different layers of the histological layers of the digestive tract. Does this sound familiar to anybody? But I will show you here what we mean by that. Here's the duodenum, and in its submucosa you find these mucus secreting glands, just massive numbers of these. They call them Brunner's glands. They're secreting mucus, alkaline mucus. Why would the duodenum need all these mucus secreting glands? Alkaline mucus secreting glands. Why would the duodenum need that? To protect it from the stomach acid that's coming down. By the time it gets into the jejunum, do we still need that? No, we've already, actually by the time we get to the jejunum, the chyme is diluted so much, it's actually got, with all the bicarbonate, it's actually gone from being acidic to actually being alkaline, slightly alkaline, so we don't need that anymore. The jejunum basically has a nondescript submucosa, and there's nothing in it. But here we are in the ileum, and we find those Peyer's patches that you will be tested on also on Thursday because they were part of your lymphatic system. They were part of your mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, MALT. that included, right, like your tonsils. Mm-hmm. Sounding familiar? Will it sound familiar hopefully by Thursday? If it doesn't sound familiar, I hope it does. As you do too. But here we can again, so when you're looking for regional differences, first place, easiest place to look is where? Submucosa. You see what you see? If you don't see anything in the submucosa, it's just jejunum, because the jejunum really has like nothing in it. It has massive villi. The villi, which are increased in the surface area, are the biggest in the jejunum. I guess that's really the only thing that really stands out in the jejunum, is it just has these massively huge villi in them here. They're not as big in the other sections. This is showing you what it looks like in a cadaver. And the nice thing about these laser pointers, these cat toys, is that they do not work on these boards here. Isn't that fun? I can, go on, chase it, go on, chase the little pointer. But I try to do it there, you can't do it. Yeah. So they're just trying to sort of show that you can, here's be the stomach up here, all right? And this is the distal end of it here. You can see that would be the pyloric sphincter here, and then you go into your small intestine, all right? You've got your large intestine mostly here. Oh, there's a little appendix. There's some little appendix here. Cecum here. You got an ascending, transverse, descending limb here. This is all intestine here. Why did I even pick this up? I thought it might. I wonder if that was a special moment. Regional differences. No, but I will mention, this is the part of histology that's worth knowing, is that in order to digest food well, right, Solly is demonstrating for us here today, is that you need to have a lot of surface area for absorption. So we have folds on top of folds on top of folds to just keep increasing surface area and surface area. You saw that the stomach actually had folds, like the where you got folds in the intestines, and then you've got these projections on top of them that are called villi. And on the villi are cells themselves that have their own little projections that are called microvilli. So we have villi that are covered with simple columnar cells that themselves are covered with all these little microvilli here. All of them increase in the surface area for absorption. All right? And each of the little villi is going to have a capillary bed in them to absorb the nutrients, all right? Going to have blood supply, nerve, and what is this green thing in here? A lacteal. What are we absorbing in the lacteals? Because this is going to come up on the test too, potentially. Fats, thank you. This is for fat absorption, because fats get packaged in these massively big bundles of lipoproteins that are just way too big to get into a normal capillary. The only way they can enter circulation is through the very permeable lacteals that allow massive things to get in. And that's why they're called lacteals, because when you absorb a lot of fats, then the lymphatic fluid is going to look milky white as it travels up through the cisterna chyli, up into the thoracic duct. Yeah. No, nothing here. Nothing worth mentioning here. I'm trying to see what I can save time on here. Reflexes again. Gastroenteric. Have we seen something that looks like this before?
Yes.
Before we saw an enterogastric reflex, right? Mm-hmm. Enterogastric was initiated from where? The intestine to target the the stomach. How's that going to differ from the gastroenteric reflex? It's going to be initiated from what? Stomach to target the intestines. This tends to be an excitatory one here. Distension of the stomach increases the motility along the intestines. The idea behind this, and if I'm taking in food in the stomach now and it's stretching, all right, we need to make room for the intestines. So if we've got partially digested foods in the intestines, we need to start doing what? Moving that along. All right, if there's stuff that's just hanging around in there, all right, just, hanging out in there, we need to move that along. So the gastroenteric reflex comes from the stomach distension, and it's going to increase intestinal motility so that we make room for the next meal that's on its way. All right. Now, to make room for the next meal, we're going to have to get partially digested food out of the small intestine into the large intestine. And that, my friends, is the gastroileal reflex. Gastro from the stomach, ileo referring to the, the ileum really, and especially the ileocecal valve, the valve between the ileum and the cecum. So distension of the stomach is going to relax that ileocecal valve so that whatever was left over in our small intestine, we can now move into the large intestine. Which helps to explain why sometimes after you've had a meal, you might feel the need to poop is the technical word, yes.
Deficit?
Babies do this all the time. Babies just do this all the time. You feed the baby and it's pooping like.
Goes right through them.
It just goes right through. It's right. Just. I saw. No.
Are you sure?
Well, maybe okay. I saw this. It was around Christmas. There was this a more what I thought a more realistic display of like the Holy Family, with Mary holding like a baby Jesus. But in this case here, Mary actually had like a cloth on her shoulder.
Like a birthday cloth?
Yes, and a cloth on her shoulder because that's what real mothers do, right? It's like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have my good Christmas clothes on here. You want something new, so it's like even the baby Jesus has that little spit up. Little baby Jesus. I just like the realism behind that since I've never ever seen that before. Probably a lot of people assume, no, baby Jesus never did that. No. Not that baby Jesus. All right. So are we okay with these two reflexes? Understand the concept behind it. Gastroenteric, from the stomach to what? Small intestine speeding up, right? The gastroileal reflex, opening up the ileocecal valve so that we can move whatever's left from the small intestine now into the large intestine. Most of the substances necessary for digestion, bile, digestive enzymes, except for the brush border enzymes and bicarbonate, all come from the pancreas and the liver, right? Pancreas and the liver, especially the pancreas, right? The liver does the liver do anything really except to digest lipids? No. It's bile salts from the liver. That's its really only function of the bile salts in the liver. Now, I'm going to mention this right now. When we did the cardiovascular system earlier, I think we mentioned that there were additional types of vascular systems that were called portal systems. Did we talk about this? Do we do portal systems at all?
No.
I'm seeing a little deer in the headlights, so I'm guessing that's a no. I'll do this over here. Normal cardiovascular system, you're aware. Oh, gosh. Throw this away. All right. Is this any better? Oh, maybe. We have an artery, that actually branch into arterioles that would branch into what? What do you think I'm trying to draw here? That's a capillary bed, people. My drawing's not that bad. You should be able to figure out if this is an artery here, that I'm drawing a capillary bed here. So much disrespect. Huh? And then the blood would return back to the heart in a vein. But in just a couple places in your body, something weird happens. This vein will go into a completely different organ, branch into a second capillary bed. What am I drawing here, people? See, I told you could see. I told you it was easy to tell what this is. Bunch of art critics here. Before returning back to the heart. So we have two capillary beds in series. We have capillary bed 1, then leading to what? Capillary bed 2. We have this kind of system. There's a black one here. We have this kind of system where we want to pick up something in capillary bed 1 and deliver it directly to the organ fed by capillary bed 2. And we call the veins that connect them portal veins. There was one of these portal systems that you saw in 109, whether you knew it or not, that was between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. It was called the hypophyseal portal system. And that way that all the hormones that the hypothalamus made that controlled the anterior pituitary, the growth hormone releasing hormones, the prolactin releasing hormones, the gonadotrophin releasing hormones, all those hormones that only affected the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary would just be directly taken to the anterior pituitary. Why am I bringing this up now? Because, for our purposes, there's a much more important portal system between the intestines, small intestines, and the liver. And they refer to this as the hepatic portal system. And the vessel that goes between the intestines and the liver, they would call the hepatic portal vein. Which means that we are picking up stuff from the intestines and transporting it directly to the liver. So the liver gets the first crack at everything you eat. It's going to see it before everything else sees it. So that the liver can remove some toxins, for example. It's your major detoxifying organ. Are you sort of familiar with that?
One more time, what did you say?
It detoxifies compounds. It can help to remove excess glucose and store it as glycogen, all those things. But one major thing that this does is that this will recycle bile salts. To repeat, the hepatic portal system will recycle bile salts. 95% of the bile salts get recycled. How would that work? Well, the liver creates bile salts, stores them in the gallbladder, correct? Stores in the gallbladder, all right? And then after you've had a meal rich in fats or carbohydrates or even partially digested proteins, all right? Once it starts to get in the intestine, the intestinal cells will start to secrete what enzyme? I tell you, what hormone? You were thinking, what else is he talking about? We'll start to release what hormone? CCK, and that will trigger the gallbladder to release its contents into the intestines, right? All these bile salts. Now the bile salts are released where? Into the intestines. And as they go through the intestines, eventually those bile salts get reabsorbed. And then what happens to those reabsorbed bile salts? They get taken right back to where they came from, which was what? The liver. And they get pulled back out of the liver so that most of the bile salts that you are secreting are just recycled ones. You only produce a little bit of new bile salts every day. Most of the bile salts just get recycled back and forth using this hepatic portal system. All right, pancreas. Let's finish this up real quick. Pancreas, we've already mentioned, secretes enzymes that break down every category of organic compound, right? Amylase will begin the breakdown of starch. Actually began in the mouth, right, with salivary amylase. But it's beginning to break starch down, or finishing the digestion of starch into things like maltose, right? Lipases for the digestion of lipids, assuming they've been emulsified by the bile salts. Nucleases that break down nucleic acids. And proteases, 4 different proteases for breaking down proteins. As we mentioned, they all have to be secreted as proenzymes, not in their active forms. The bicarbonate, again, secreted primarily in response to secretin. And let's see if we can remember this. Activity primarily regulated by intestinal hormones, cholecystokinin, CCK, triggers it to release what? The enzyme-rich fluid that will break down all these categories of organic compounds. What will secretin trigger it to release?
Acid.
Yeah. Secretin will trigger it to release this bicarbonate buffer-rich solution to buffer all of that stomach acid. Gallbladder, small kiwi-sized. People know what a kiwi? Now, sometimes people in New Zealand will refer to their residents as kiwis. So we're not talking about like a full-size adult New Zealander here. We're talking about this small little furry green fruit here. Located on the inferior side of the liver. Remember how hard it was for you to find that because it was like intimate with that right lobe of the liver here? When it contracts here, again, it moves bile into cystic duct to the common bile duct, and we will see that down here. So here it is coming down here. We can see the secretions into the common bile duct. Here's a cystic duct here coming in from the gallbladder here. Bile salts, as you know, rely on, or are needed for the digestion of absorption. Unlike other components of bile that are generally eliminated in the feces, bile salts are recycled via this hepatic circulation. This enterohepatic circulation is just the hepatic portal system. Entero referring again to what? Intestines. Hepatic referring to liver. So when you see that term enterohepatic, from the intestines to the liver. So the bile salts again get reabsorbed in the ileum and they get returned way back to the liver where they get resecreted. The little bit that you do eliminate, because again, you don't reabsorb all of it, there is a little bit of bile salts that get secreted. And this is actually one of the few ways that you actually get rid of cholesterol. So your fecal matter will contain small amounts of extra cholesterol. That's one way to remove these here. Too much of the cholesterol in your bile ducts and in the gallbladder can start to crystallize, forming gallstones. which apparently can be very painful. And they're trying to pass. Anybody know people? This is a relatively common problem. Extremely painful. Do you have family members or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to tell people how painful or no? No.
It's painful.
A lot of screaming. A lot of.
Well, I never seen my father cry, so he had gallstones.
No.
Oh my God.
Right. Yet still a grown man who never cried, and then until this happened. Okay. Relation to pancreatic secretion. This is actually just a review of what we've already mentioned. Is that pancreatic juices in the bile from CCK and secretin? We've already previously discussed that, right? There's a little bit by the vagus nerve directly. Not much, you really need those two hormones, but should it come as a shock that the vagus nerve stimulation would trigger you to release at least some of these digestive juices? Hopefully it wouldn't come as too much of a shock, considering that vagus is almost synonymous with digestion here. And the bile salts are a major stimulus for bile secretion. As you begin to absorb them, release them, it triggers you to produce more. All right, now to sum up real quickly. Digestion and absorption. I'm going to start with the following here, and it's going to save us a lot of time, all right? Almost all absorption of nutrients is going to be done by two different things. Facilitated diffusion, and then secondary active transport, they call co-transport. Do you remember co-transport? Secondary active transport? Primary active transport, as you remember, like the sodium potassium pump, use ATP directly. All right. In secondary active transport, all right, we've spent a lot of energy pumping sodium out, all right. We can use its energy to try to get back in to push other things against their will. They call that secondary active transport. And most of those secondary active transports are co-transport with sodium. Almost all the co-transports are sodium linked. So it's an indirect form of active transport. Good rule of thumb is that when nutrients are high, like early on in the small intestine, nutrient levels are high, we can use a passive process like facilitated diffusion. But after facilitated diffusion is equaled out concentrations, if you want to absorb the rest of them, you're going to need some type of active transport. That's where the co-transport comes in. So virtually all the final absorption is going to be done by those processes. Facilitated diffusion when concentrations of the nutrients are high. Co-transport almost always with sodium when their concentrations are low. All right? And water is always going to be absorbed by osmosis. Once you absorb the particles, either by active transport, co-transport, or facilitated diffusion, an osmotic equivalence of water will follow it. You don't need any kind of special pumping mechanisms. You pump the particles out, water follows by osmosis. So they talk about absorption, two mechanisms, co-transport and facilitated diffusion. Co-transport, is always going to be linked to, almost always linked to sodium link. We spend energy pumping sodium out, we're going to let it come back in and drag something against its will. So that's carbohydrate. We've already seen that carbohydrate digestion begins where? The mouth-salivary amylase. Continues in the stomach, but there's no new until we get to the small intestine where pancreatic amylase will finish digesting it primarily into maltose. And then we have our small little disaccharides like glucose or maltose that get broken down in the brush border into monomers. And then we're going to use like co-transport to get that in, facilitated diffusion. And notice that they're showing, of course, in order to keep that co-transport going, you're going to need your old friend, the sodium potassium pump to keep that concentration gradient to where it is. Protein digestion begins where? Stomach. All right. Small intestine, we've got a bunch of enzymes secreted by what gland? Pancreas. 4 different proteases. I'm not going to expect you to memorize the list of of all of them. Trypsin is the one that tends to convert the other ones into active ones. All right. Acidic gastric juices would denature them. Brush border we mentioned. We're going to break down the dipeptidases into individual ones. What mechanisms we're going to use? Co-transport and facilitated diffusion. How did that happen?
I think you zoomed in too much.
What did I do?
I think you double tap. So try to zoom out. Yeah.
So here just showing that we're digesting it. We're going to pull it in again by our co-transport with our old friend, sodium, and use facilitate diffusion. Lipid digestion. I mentioned that lingual lipase is not going to show up on the test. Insignificant amount of lipid digestion with lingual lipase here. It's really the bile salts and pancreatic lipase like we did in our experimental lab that do that. Here we have different absorption because it's lipids. We can't just use our basic process. We have to package them in a form that we can transport through bodily fluids. And because lipids are not going to be water soluble or plasma soluble, we have to transport them by packaging them with proteins, a form of lipoprotein that they call kilomicrons. Kilomicrons is just a fancy type of lipoprotein. It's a combination of lipids and proteins. Would you expect the lipids to be on the outside or on the inside of this package?
On the inside.
On the inside. And the wrapping on the outside are going to be the proteins because they're going to be more water soluble. That's how we transport them. So kilomicrons are the way that they get absorbed. Will they then go into normal capillaries, the kilomicrons?
Yeah.
No. They will go into lacteals.
Right.
Ah. Who's going to miss that one on a test?
Me.
Not you. I will hurt you if you miss that on the test, if I put that on a test, because I've just gone over that with you. Lipids are going to be, the kilomicrons are going to be absorbed by?
Lacteals.
Lacteals. Will it turn into milky white color?
Yes.
Yes. Now the kilomicrons then get taken up by the liver. And then the liver will repackage them into like HDL, LDLs. You've heard of those type of cholesterols? It primarily, we'll see that if we have time later, it primarily sends them out as LDLs. LDL is like the bad kind of cholesterol. It's being sent out from your liver after the liver has repackaged the kilomicrons. And that's the kind that can accumulate in blood vessels, causing atherosclerosis and blockage and plaques and things like this. Excess is sent back from your tissues to the liver to be removed as HDLs. So that's why HDL cholesterols are considered to be the good type of cholesterols. So when we talk about HDL being cholesterol is only one component of these lipoproteins, all right? But it's an important component, so that's why we speak about it. Okay. So they're released, and of course they're going to diffuse into the lacteals. Transported where? Back to the liver, eventually. And then the liver repackages them. So here's our big lipids. The bile salts will emulsify them into small little things here, get reabsorbed. Okay. So this is trying to show how the kilomicrons, the lipids get packaged in these, lipids on the inside, coating of proteins on the outside here. There's kilomicrons. Get absorbed in the lymphatic system, back into circulation. I do this on a regular basis down in here without realizing. Water absorption, tell me about water absorption. By osmosis. Pretty much it can be absorbed by osmosis along virtually the entire length of the intestines. By osmosis. Don't worry about all the numbers it's showing. There's mass amounts that get absorbed of fluids because you're dumping huge amounts of, you might have about 2 liters of fluid in the foods that you eat, but your saliva over the course of a day is going to dump about another 1.5 liters of fluid in. Stomach itself makes another like 5 liters, or I'm sorry, like 1,500 mils. Intestinal secretions, maybe another 2 liters throughout the entire. So all this ultimately gets reabsorbed as we reabsorb the particles. Now, having said that, okay, if you are dehydrated, or if somebody's like dehydrated, dehydrated, one of the worst things you can give them is a full-strength sports drink. Because a full-strength sports drink is going to be hypertonic. Full strength tend to be what? Hypertonic. Which means as soon as that full-strength Gatorade gets into the small intestine, if it's hypertonic, it's going to pull fluid out of your bloodstream, out of your body, into your small intestine to, in order to dilute that down to normal bodily strength. You will actually, the rest of your body will lose fluid for a little while until you start to absorb the sugars and the nutrients and the electrolytes a little bit later out of the sports drink, and then the osmotic equivalents of water will follow. If you want to rehydrate quick, pure water. Pure water, because that's as hypotonic you can get. Pure water, hypotonic. Or if you like sports drinks, dilute them. A lot of people I know will dilute. They don't taste very good when you dilute them, but they'll dilute Gatorade or other sports drink, or some people like orange juice for that kind of reason, when they were running a marathon or something, but dilute it. Dilute it down so it's not hypertonic when it reaches your intestine. And then the summary charts I'm not going to go through, but they're good to look at it because in one view you can sort of see all the different types of compounds, where they're absorbed. How much time have we got? Like 2 minutes here. Okay.
Yeah, no.
Well, the liver, we've spoken about already a lot about the liver and what the liver does. It is your largest organ. Aside from your integument, your skin, technically that's a large one here, but in terms of being a discrete one here, it's the liver. What else do I want you to know about the liver? I'm not going to go into the hepatocytes. Hepato is a prefix. You should know this much at least. Hepato is a prefix that refers to what?
Liver.
The liver. Somebody has hepatitis, it's their liver that's been infected here. But the cells of the liver, the hepatocytes, can help to stabilize blood sugar levels. You saw this hopefully in 109 because they can undergo gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. They can store extra glucose as glycogen. Right? Remove some of the excess amino acids. They can store, break down lipids. Mineral storage, at least some iron, some fat-soluble vitamins here. They play an important role in detoxifying the bloods, converting ammonia, synthesizing proteins, which is why if you've got liver failure, you've got a lot of trouble, people. And now we're down to the large intestine. We're pretty much done here. Large intestine. What's going on in the large intestine? Well, there's no, listen, let's start with this. There's no villi once we get into large intestine. No villi, certainly no microvilli, because really all the absorption, that's done within the small intestine. No new nutrient absorption, no new digestion is going on here. The only thing that's going on here is following. We absorb just the right amount of electrolytes and water.
In the large intestine? In the large intestine?
I can't hear, sorry. That we're absorbing just the right amount of electrolytes and water from the fecal matter and compacting the fecal matter so that the fecal matter has the right consistency, which is important.
Very.
What happens if you absorb too much water and electrolytes out of it?
Yeah.
Then you end up what?
Diarrhea.
No, what if you absorb too much of the water and electrolytes out of it?
It hurts you.
Then you're right. Constipated. then you're constipated and you have to take the softeners, or you have to, go in there with a coat hanger or something. I hate when that happens here. So just get that image out of your head. But of course, if you don't absorb the right amount of water, if you leave too much water and electrolytes in there, now you've got diarrhea, which I think I mentioned before is a leading cause of death worldwide because of the loss of electrolytes, all the other things that go along with that here. So that's why getting the right amount of liquid out is an important thing that it does here. All right. No new nutrients go on, except it can absorb things that the bacteria are making. That's the only nutrient absorption are not coming from you, or the nutrients that are made from whatever's left over by the enteric bacteria. And there are billions of them living in colonies. They have structure inside of your intestines. They're like little mini civilizations, biofilms inside of there that create vitamin K and a little bit of some B vitamins, like a little bit of B5, so you get a little bit of it. But the big one is vitamin K. For most people, about half your vitamin K is made by your enteric bacteria. So you're absorbing water, and again, the only way you will absorb water is by what process? Osmosis. So the way it works is you're going to pump out the remaining electrolytes that you want to retain, and water follows by osmosis. Let's see, there is mucus secreted in the walls. I probably shouldn't need to mention, but there's going to be mucus here to help them make the passage of fecal material a little bit easier. Doing that. And that's it, people. Oh, no, okay, sorry, I didn't mention that. Just real quick about defecation. We've mentioned, of course, some vitamin K, a little other B vitamins, certainly not as much. Vitamin K is the big one, some Bs, B5, a little B7 here. Defecation. Defecation is primarily going to be a parasympathetic mediated reflex. Should this come as a shock? Hopefully not. But this will not be done by the vagus nerve, will it? Because we're below the vagus nerve. Mm-hmm. We are down in the sacral region of your spinal cord. S2, S3, S4. Did you do this in 109?
I don't remember.
I did it with you in lab, I think, didn't I, or no?
No.
Okay. Well, S2, S3, and S4 are the segments of your spinal cord where parasympathetic coming from. And one thing that parasympathetic is involved with, that hopefully you did in 109, was sexual arousal. Did you cover that? Where the events of climax are more sympathetic nervous system, but the events of sexual arousal is parasympathetic. And the way I was taught to remember this was S2, S3, S4 keeps the penis off the floor.
Oh, you've said that. Yeah.
To remind you that it's that segment S2, S3, S4 that's involved in parasympathetic activity, basically below the navel. Mm-hmm. And it's that sacral section of the spinal cord that's also going to be involved in both defecation and urination. Because that micturition reflex, avoiding your bladder, is almost identical to what's happening with your bowels. Almost identical. That you've got two sets of, we'll just mention this right now. Oh my gosh, then we got time. You have two sets of sphincters controlling the exits. The internal sphincter, smooth muscle. External sphincter, skeletal muscle. And it'll be the same with the urinary systems. Internal one is smooth muscle, external one is what? Skeletal muscle. So when you're bowel begins to sort of fill with mass. It tends to trigger this mass movement reflex. This distension of the bowel sends signals up to what section of the spinal cord? Is it sending them to the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, or the sacral region of your spinal cord? Sacral region of the spinal cord, because that's where these reflexes are initiated from. And that will send reflexes back that will tend to trigger that internal sphincter to open up and dilate. And normally that also causes reflexive relaxation of the external one. So that when you're a little baby, for example, all right, and the internal one relaxes, the external one will also relax, and the baby will poop. Fortunately, you people tend to be in that wonderful window of your life where you've got control over that external sphincter. So that even if the mood comes to you, it's like, ooh, I need to defecate, all right? You can keep clamped down on that external sphincter to prevent yourself from defecating where it might not be convenient or really even socially appropriate. And it will be the same when you do the urinary system. There's also the two sets of sphincters. Internal is going to be smooth muscle, involuntary. External one, skeletal muscle that is voluntary. And again, there do tend to be reflexes between them. So for example, if you're going on a long trip, it's okay, I'm going to try to go to the bathroom beforehand, right? That if you make an effort to relax the external one, it will also tend to relax the internal one. So you do have that going back and forth. Okay. So we have these short reflexes are local. The long reflexes would be the ones that would go back to your head. And we're done. We're more than done. When we get into lab, I'll give everybody at least 10 minutes now to get into lab here. We get